And so essentially, sociology is the study of the human world in groups. So now we come to the part where we discuss ontology, epistemology, and methodology. Very important concepts when we start any research. Ontology basically is your belief in what exists, your belief in what is real, what is out there, and what phenomenon can be studied. And epistemology basically, in layperson's terms, refers to what kind of proof or evidence will you be willing to accept to prove that that phenomenon exists. And therefore your ontology and epistemology, your belief in phenomenon, and your choice of evidence will of course influence your choice of method or your methodology greatly. Hence, the question to be asked in this part or this section of the lecture is whether sociology is a science. To answer this question of whether sociology is a science, we have to first define what does science mean. We often hear about the debate between the sciences and the social sciences. But can these two fields be reconciled? Is science universal? Now let us start by defining what science is all about. Anything that can be observed objectively and systematically using methods that are reliable can be described as scientific. So we will here be exposed to three arguments within sociologists and philosophers themselves as to whether sociology can be considered a science. There are those who believe that science must be completely objective and sterile, while there are those who believe that all science is guided by values. So let us go with the first perspective. That is very much a perspective led by sociologists themselves. Now, in the origins of sociology, it basically originated as a project to unveil what are the mechanisms guiding society and how do we identify what society needs for it to survive, to thrive, and to progress. Basically, Auguste Comte, also known as the founder of sociology, was a secretary to an aristocrat, Comte de Saint-Simon, a French aristocrat who, despite being an aristocrat, wanted to reform society in a way that would benefit all social classes, or in other words, people of any background, regardless of whether they are aristocrats, middle class people, or peasants, or whatnot. So this was after the Industrial Revolution, and this was a time where science, as in the natural sciences, was thriving, and people believed in the concept of evolution from a primitive to an advanced stage, belief in the concept of survival of the fittest. So you have Herbert Spencer, you have Charles Darwin, and they believed that society, just like organisms, could also evolve from a more simple to a more complex stage. So at this point of time, in Europe, in the 1800s, the entire zeitgeist, or the entire spirit, was all about applying the principle and the logic of the natural sciences, because they believed in evolutionism. So basically, Comte de Saint-Simon and Auguste Comte believed that sociology should be established as a field, which they actually called social physics in the beginning, because they were very much influenced by natural sciences. They wanted to know how to study what guides and motivates humans in the same way we study what guides and motivates atoms and molecules. So therefore, Comte believed that sociology should be the queen of the sciences, or the leader of all the other sciences, and its objective should be to reform society in a positive way, in a way that leads to evolution from basic to advanced. So together with Herbert Spencer, Comte believed that using social physics, which is the original name they intended for sociology, They believed that we could try to discover general laws that would help us understand how society worked and changed. In other words, to find independent variables that would lead to dependent variables or outcomes, and how we could then manipulate these variables to change the outcome of society. So this perspective is called positivism because they believe in getting from a basic point to a more advanced point. In other words, it's positivistic. To be able to classify something as positivist, it has to display three main characteristics. So to be able to tell or classify whether any particular research is positivist, it has to demonstrate three characteristics, which is number one, causality. This research assumes that there is an independent variable that causes the dependent variable to happen as a result. So causality, A makes B happen. For example, people tend to associate crime and poverty. They might say poverty causes crime. So when there's a research that assumes that there is statistical relationship between crime and poverty, as though one causes the other, then that's said to have causality. The second characteristic is determinism, which implies that people do things simply because something else causes it. So this is an assumption that humans are motivated by individual factors. Again, to use the example of poverty causing people to turn to crime, this embraces a very stimuli-response assumption. In other words, believing that human beings are somewhat like tools that can be manipulated. So sometimes some theories or perspectives are attacked for being too deterministic. For example, Karl Marx, as we'll come to later, some of his critics believed that he was an economic determinist because apparently, according to these critics, he believed that an individual's relation to material resources or economic resources like money will totally influence all their actions towards others in society. So that can be described as being deterministic. And the final characteristic here is empiricism, which is the belief that the only true way of understanding any social phenomenon is by making systematic observations, which you then test again and again. Very much like the sciences, the natural sciences. They assume that human behavior can be tested again and again, like you can test a sample in a lab again and again. So for strictly positivist research, their main research method mainly consists of experimentation and surveys. And therefore, among the classical sociologists, which we'll come to later, Emil Durkheim's work would be among the most landmark positivist work, especially his work on suicide, which looks at 4 different factors as to why people committed suicide in France in the 1800s, in the peak of the Industrial Revolution. So having looked at the positivist viewpoint of what social science is all about, we can see that there are several flaws in making these 3 assumptions, which are causality, determinism, and empiricism, because they really limit the ability of social science to be able to explain the whole range of human interaction. So this is where you have a response, an entire paradigm developed in response to positivism, known as interpretivism. What interpretivism is all about is about the ability to understand human behavior and the underlying meanings behind social action or meaningful social action, hence interpreting or interpretivism. So the interpretivists mainly developed their perspective as a response to positivism's beliefs. They questioned the logic and method of positivism, although not entirely rejecting it. They did believe that we should be systematic and objective in our sociological observations, but not to rely too strongly on the 3 assumptions, which are causality, determinism, and empiricism. So the main theorist behind the perspective of interpretivism was known as Max Weber, another very famous sociologist who also developed a lot of his theories in response to Karl Marx's predictions, especially with regard to the rise of capitalism. So Max Weber was known for his perspective, which is called Verstehen. In other words, the German word for understanding, or the method of understanding things from the individual's perspective, which is very unique to every single individual, rather than finding external laws governing it. So in other words, this referred to being able to understand every single individual's unique social action. So in tandem with that, Weber also suggested that people continue using systematic observations in the sense of the natural sciences, but the only thing was to change the objective to look at things from the other person's point of view. Thus, Weber also believed that no knowledge can be entirely objective, because all research is essentially value-guided. One is, of course, compelled to choose a particular topic based on one's preferences. So the main belief here is not to reject the concept of natural sciences, but to believe that there are significant differences between the natural and social worlds. In the natural world, perhaps things are a bit more predictable, but in the social world, this is where we can use symbolism, and therefore it varies according to every single individual situation. People are able to attach intrinsic meanings to their actions, whereas other organisms, like plants and animals, do not. There is no symbolism or deeper meaning for organisms apart from humans. Thus, they suggested that sociology should take into account these major differences in its research methods. To be able to hence understand from a first-hand perspective the meanings that individuals attribute to their social actions, the research method under interpretivism is ethnography, or also known as participant observation. In other words, this is an approach that attempts to let the researcher live the life of the person being studied and see things through the eyes of the subject, or in other words, to walk a mile in the person's shoes. As you can see, this particular research method is very different from experiments or surveys, which are very quantitative and fixed in terms of their scope and definition and what you can answer as a respondent. In ethnography, it's almost like an exploration. The world's your oyster. There is no fixed laboratory, and there is a whole plethora of meanings to be discovered out there. So ethnography here is very much drawn from the tradition of phenomenology, which is the ability to make sense of how people attribute meanings to their social actions. Phenomenology was developed by Alfred Schutz. Formally, this means the study of everyday life, focusing on people's stream of consciousness, as in what goes on in their minds, as they go along behaving throughout the day, and the ways they attach meanings to their actions. So the main key classical sociologist that falls under interpretivism would be Max Weber. Finally, can we come to a reconciliation or a combination of the perspectives of natural sciences as well as the social sciences? Apparently, there has been a synthesis of positivism and also interpretivism, and this is what we call here in sociology as realism, where it falls under the philosophies of science. The realists also developed their perspective with regards and with response to the positivists and the interpretivists. And the realists here are different from the two above, in that they believe that sociology in fact can and should follow natural science, logic and methods. So it's not wrong at all to be systematic or objective, or even quantitative, in doing one's observations on human behavior with regards to social relationships. However, they do allow for some changes in the way this scientific endeavor would be carried out. Like positivism, realism accepts social structures have some form of independent existence that we can call external. Or in other words, these social structures have binding effects upon us as individuals. These structures act upon us, pressurizing and constraining our behavior. Again, these things could include social constructs such as the family, the economy, the monetary system, the law, and so on and so forth. Because these things are socially created by human beings, and yet they have an impact upon how the individual lives their lives. So in a way, they can be said to be independent variables. And social structures are themselves the product of specific social relationships and can result in a relationship based on power. And that's why we have the topic of power under sociology, where we study the way power is concentrated, often in the hands of a few. However, what realists define as science differs from positivism. While positivism focuses on only the observations, the empirical and quantitative observations of what humans do, realism focuses more on theory building. So in other words, positivists might go out to observe, for example, incidences of crime connected to poverty. Then only will they attempt to construct a hypothesis, which they will then test, and when it's proven, it becomes a theory. Now, realists do things the other way about. They first come up with a theory about how the world works, and then they go out to test it by doing observations. So a main philosopher that falls under the category of realism would be Karl Popper, who held that science should be something that progresses. In other words, we improve the scientific method by refutation of ideas. How does this work? Alright, Karl Popper believes that we, as researchers, can never observe the entirety of any phenomenon. For example, if we were an avid bird watcher and we have observed 100 swans and they are all white, can we therefore conclude with absolute certainty that all swans in the world are white? Well, we might not have observed 101 swan or other swans that escape our attention that could be in other colors. So what happens then? When we have made this observation finally that there are in fact swans of different colors, then this would actually not completely result in the rejection of our theory about swans, but it will add to the improvement of our knowledge about the existing types of swans out there. So we could refine our theory and say, for every 100 swans that are white, there is another swan that is black. Hence, the realists believe that science by pure empiricism or pure quantitative observation is not strong enough. It has to be refined. It has to be tested. The theory has to be tortured, like what they say about lies, damn lies, and statistics. And if you torture the data enough, it will tell you something. That's a joke, by the way. So we cannot observe all swans, but we can develop our knowledge by refining our theories, by doing more and more observations that attempt to disprove the theory that we have come up with. So the stronger the theory is, the more it can hold water, the more it can stand the test of time. So scientific knowledge expands and becomes better and more accurate as we now know which theories are wrong. Thereby, we can eliminate all the wrong theories, and this will leave us with the theory that is right. So in other words, the realists believe in aspects of reality that remain hidden and unobserved beneath the surface of what we can see. So a major classical theorist that falls under this category would be that of Karl Marx.